Welcome back to Red Horizons. I'm your host, Steve McPhail, and today we begin a new series, diving into the work of Larry Niven. Let's leave behind the dust and revolution of Mars and step onto a different kind of engineered world. One that's bigger, brighter, and more unsettling in its ideological implications. This is Episode 5, Terraforming the Human, Labor, Identity, and the Body in Ringworld. I'll be honest, Larry Niven was one of my favorite authors when I was growing up. I devoured his books for the scale, the science, the wild frontiers. Ringworld, in particular, felt limitless. This vast, impossible ribbon of adventure, discovery, and mystery. It sparked something in me, the way only science fiction can. But as I got older, I began to notice more than just the world building. I saw the world view. Because Ringworld isn't just a setting, it's an ideological system. A technocratic fantasy that treats inequality as biology, labor as destiny, and freedom as a managed variable. Niven's Ringworld is a marvel of speculative scale, a ribbon of matter encircling a star, constructed by an extinct godlike race, designed to house untold billions. It's a classic of hard science fiction, praised for its physics, ambition, and world building. But beneath its dazzling engineering lies a darker architecture, one built on hierarchy, social engineering, and the naturalization of exploitation. Niven's future isn't emancipatory, it's eugenic. It's Malthusian. It's governed by invisible hands and omnipresent breeders, where people are shaped to fit systems, not the other way around. His universe doesn't imagine dismantling power. It imagines managing it more efficiently. And in that obsession, we can see something familiar. To unpack this, we'll look closely at Ringworld's portrayals of engineered intelligence, bodily optimization, racialized difference, and technocratic determinism. We'll examine how its characters embody, sometimes literally, the ideologies that shape their world. And we'll trace how Niven's fiction reflects a worldview in which freedom is not a right, but a parameter to be adjusted. To help us do that, we'll draw from Silvia Federici on the disciplining of reproductive labor, from Michel Foucault on biopolitics and the management of populations, from Ruth Hubbard and Dorothy Roberts on the legacy of eugenics in science and statecraft, and from Karl Marx on how labor becomes flesh under capitalism. Because the real fantasy in Ringworld isn't the structure, it's the system that builds it, and the belief that such a system could be stable, inevitable, or good. Beneath its megastructure shine and scientific gloss, Ringworld reveals a brutal logic. Bodies engineered for compliance, futures managed like inventory, and power masquerading as progress. Built to fit intelligence, breeding, and the tyranny of design. In Ringworld, intelligence is the most valuable trait a person can possess, and the most dangerous. Louis Wu is chosen for the mission not because he's brave, strong, or moral. He's chosen because he's smart, and crucially, because he's old. In Niven's universe, age doesn't imply wisdom. It implies survival through Earth's lottery-based reproduction system, a system designed to breed luck, intelligence, and compliance into the species. Tila Brown is the logical endpoint of that system. Born of successive winners of the birthright lottery, she's the product of a eugenics program dressed up as democratic fairness. She is, quite literally, too lucky to die. Her role on the mission is not to contribute skills, but to test a hypothesis, whether the breeding program has succeeded in producing not just intelligence, but destiny. This isn't a side plot. It's the ideological center of the novel. Niven's future doesn't merely reward intelligence. It selects for it. It breeds for it. And in doing so, it naturalizes a hierarchy of ability, one in which the population is sorted, managed, and quietly culled, not by open violence, but by policy. This is the eugenic imagination, the belief that society can be improved by controlling reproduction, that social programs are biological programs, that the future is a matter of genes, not justice. In Ringworld, as in so many eugenic fantasies, the imagined danger isn't tyranny, it's entropy, stupidity, laziness, chaos. The underclass isn't oppressed, it's designed out of existence. The solution to this supposed decline is always the same: manage the stock, improve the breed, engineer better humans. Niven didn't invent this logic, he inherited it. From Francis Galton's pseudo-scientific fantasies of hereditary genius to B.F. Skinner's dreams of behavioral engineering, the idea that human beings should be optimized has shaped the machinery of modern governance. Galton's eugenics gave a blueprint for racialized social engineering, while Skinner's behaviorism imagined a society governed by stimulus and response, each seeking to erase unpredictability, deviance, and dissent in the name of order. And this ideology didn't disappear, it adapted. A glaring example is the bell curve, the 1994 bestseller by Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein. Murray and Herrnstein argued that intelligence is largely heritable, that IQ predicts everything from income to criminality, and that social inequality is the inevitable result of a natural hierarchy of ability. In their framing, poverty wasn't a result of redlining, wage suppression, or systemic racism. It was the predictable outcome of a genetic lottery. The book's claims were marketed as hard science, buttressed by charts, graphs, and an air of statistical inevitability. But the data was cherry-picked, riddled with methodological flaws, and heavily reliant on studies from openly racist researchers like J. Philippe Rushton, who claimed to link brain size, IQ, and race in ways long debunked by neuroscientists and anthropologists alike. More damningly, the bell curve deliberately ignored decades of research, showing that IQ is profoundly shaped by environmental factors, nutrition, education quality, exposure to toxins, early childhood stress. It treated these as negligible, not because the evidence was lacking, but because acknowledging them would collapse the genetic determinism on which the book's conclusions rested. The policy implications were explicit. Scale back welfare, abandon affirmative action, and stop investing in programs designed to close the racial wealth gap. Because, according to their logic, such efforts are doomed to fail. This wasn't neutral analysis. It was a political project to naturalize inequality, and it gave it a veneer of inevitability. It's no coincidence that the book was embraced by libertarian think tanks, cited in anti-immigration rhetoric, and weaponized in debates over public spending. The same logic flows through Ringworld's breeding program. The idea that human worth can be ranked, quantified, and optimized, and that the system's role is not to expand opportunity, but to manage the quality of the population. And these ideas seep into law. Gifted and talented programs disproportionately exclude Black and brown students. Immigration systems privilege high-skilled workers while criminalizing others. Predictive policing uses data to justify preemptive surveillance. Today, Silicon Valley revives these fantasies under a different name: the cognitive elite. Tech leaders talk openly about genetic enhancement, AI-driven talent selection, and meritocratic destiny, as if the future belongs only to those engineered to deserve it. This is not science. It's ideology in a lab coat. What Dorothy Roberts calls a racial logic with scientific pretensions. A sleek, data-driven way to reinscribe hierarchy and decide who gets care, who gets caged, and who gets to live long enough to matter. Tela Brown's arc isn't written for transformation. She has experiences, but she functions more as a proof of concept than as an evolving character. She survives not because she adapts, but because the narrative is designed to validate the system that made her. Louis Wu, for his part, is there to observe her, to confirm the logic, to prove that when intelligence and luck are bred for long enough, they begin to look like fate. Designed for use, race, gender, and the politics of optimization. There are no equals on Ringworld. Louis Wu, the white Earth-born male, is the narrative center, not just in terms of perspective, but in terms of power. He's the observer, the problem solver, the implied rational actor among a cast of beings who are either hyper-masculinized, feminized, or rendered alien in ways that mark them as less. Nessus, the Pearson's puppeteer, is brilliant but cowardly, a being of immense intelligence who serves but never leads. Speaker to animals, the Kzen, is strength without subtlety, a predator coded as aggressive, impulsive, and honor-bound. And Tela Brown, she's neither genius nor brute. She's beautiful, loyal, obedient, lucky. Her narrative value isn't in her agency, but in her design. Each character is a vector for a trait, a walking phenotype, a narrative instrument built for contrast. And this is no accident. Ringworld is a novel obsessed with optimization. Not political optimization, which asks how people should live, but biological optimization. The right body for a given task, the right mind for the right role. In this logic, diversity of traits is not valued for its own sake. It's curated, filtered, and fixed to maximize systemic performance. This is a familiar pattern. It's the same logic that ran through colonial empires, where governing meant categorizing people into simplified types: the loyal intermediary, the docile laborer, the cunning adversary. It's what political theorist Achille Mbembe calls necropolitics, the power to decide who gets to live and who is left to die. In Ringworld, that power doesn't come through visible conquest or mass slaughter. It comes through curation. The undesirable are never conquered, they're simply never born. The technocratic gaze in Niven's universe doesn't question this system, it perfects it. Optimization becomes morality. Difference is not celebrated, it's edited down. The messiness of identity, conflict, and resistance is imagined as already resolved, not through politics, but through design. This is mirrored in real-world systems of control. Colonial censuses reduced complex ethnic, linguistic, and cultural landscapes to neat categories for easier administration. Today, algorithmic hiring tools claim to identify best fit candidates, but often replicate racial and gender biases already embedded in historical data. The sorting mechanism changes form, but the logic, assign value, enforce roles, eliminate friction, stays constant. Gender in Ringworld is not interrogated, it's a fixture. Women are rarely written as autonomous agents navigating the system. They're rewards, stabilizers, or narrative tests for the male protagonist. They're not political actors with their own projects. They're instruments within someone else's mission. Tila Brown's perfection, beauty, fertility, compliance, isn't random. It's a product of selective breeding. She's ideal not because of personal growth, but because she's been engineered to fit as seamlessly into the protagonist's arc as possible. She doesn't disrupt the plan. She doesn't challenge authority. She doesn't push for an alternative future. What about those who are not beautiful, not fit, not engineered for compatibility? They don't exist in the Ringworld we see. The narrative space is clean because it's been cleared, stripped of anyone whose presence would demand the system adapt rather than the individual. The erasure is quiet, but absolute. And that quietness is part of the danger. Sylvia Wynter calls this the coloniality of being, the way Western systems of knowledge define the human through a narrow, racialized, and gendered ideal. Those who don't fit that ideal, Black, Indigenous, disabled, queer, poor, are placed outside the category of the fully human. In Wynter's terms, Ringworld has already done this work before the story begins. There's no fight for inclusion because exclusion has already been coded into the species. Angela Davis reminds us that the body is always political terrain, whether in the struggle over reproductive rights, the policing of Black communities, or the gendered violence of incarceration. Systems of control never erase difference. They weaponize it. In Ringworld, difference is managed so thoroughly that it disappears from view, and with it, any possibility for resistance. The problem isn't just the absence of marginalized bodies. It's that their absence is treated as neutral, the natural outcome of improvement. When this logic appears in fiction, it can slip into the reader's imagination as simple world building, rather than as a deeply political choice. In the real world, similar erasures occur under the banner of progress. Urban redevelopment projects displace working-class communities of color, replacing them with optimized neighborhoods, safer for capital, less complicated for governance. AI surveillance systems claim to remove bias, but often automate the exclusion of those deemed high risk. In each case, the result is the same: a cleaner, more manageable population for those in power, achieved without ever appearing to draw a weapon. That's the soft brutality of optimization. It's not the spectacle of domination, but the quiet hum of a system that never needs to explain itself. It's already decided who counts. Ringworld's future doesn't get rid of hierarchy. It bakes it in at the genetic level. And once hierarchy is naturalized, once it feels like biology rather than policy, it becomes nearly impossible to imagine the world any other way. architecture of control, technology, infrastructure, and the managed future. The Ringworld is an engineering marvel. A ribbon of matter 93 million miles in circumference, 1,000 miles wide, rotating around its sun to create artificial gravity. It's a feat of physics and materials science that would make any hard science fiction fan's heart race. But in Niven's novel, the ring isn't just a setting. It's an allegory for the way power imagines the future. The Ringworld is not a democratic space. It's designed. Every environment, every ecosystem, every population is there for a reason, serving a function. The system has no room for unpredictability. A desert exists because the designers put it there. A fertile plain exists because it was programmed to be one. Even the placement of storms is calculated. This is infrastructure as ideology. Political theorist Langdon Winter argued that technologies are not neutral tools. They embed specific political assumptions in their design. A bridge built too low for buses to pass can be a form of racial exclusion. A voting machine with no paper trail can be a mechanism for eroding democratic accountability. On the Ringworld, design is not just about physical possibility. It's about social order. The ring's builders, the long-vanished pack protectors, are never depicted as benevolent architects. Their motives are survivalist, managerial, and paternalistic. They shape environments not for flourishing, but for stability. They engineer populations not to thrive on their own terms, but to serve a system. The Ringworld is not a commons. It's a managed habitat. And that's the critical point. This is a closed system. Every variable, from the fertility rate of a given population to the weather patterns over a given valley, can be modeled, adjusted, and optimized. The very scale of the ring suggests abundance, but abundance under total control. We've seen echoes of this in the real world. 19th century colonial powers built railroads in Africa and India, not to connect communities, but to extract resources more efficiently. Massive dams and irrigation systems in the mid-20th century were sold as tools of modernization, but often served to control populations by determining who had access to water and when. Today, the same logic runs through smart city projects from Toronto to Singapore, where data-driven infrastructure promises efficiency while deepening surveillance. In each case, the technology is presented as neutral, a solution to technical problems. But the architecture of the system encodes who gets power and who gets managed. The Ringworld's design takes this logic to its ultimate form. A society where environmental conditions are just another level of governance. You don't need to enforce order if you can shape the terrain to make disorder impossible. But there's fragility in this perfection. Systems that rely on total control are vulnerable to the unexpected. And the Ringworld's entire plot turns on that vulnerability. Micrometeorite impacts, ecological imbalance, the slow accumulation of entropy. These are cracks in the system's illusion of permanence. The habitat begins to fail, not because of rebellion, but because of physics. This is a crucial political point. Managed futures assume that the world can be modeled indefinitely, that with enough data and engineering, the messy unpredictability of life can be tamed. But no model accounts for everything. There are always unknowns. There's always decay. In our own world, climate-controlled agriculture collapses under unpredictable weather extremes. Algorithmic policing produces feedback loops that make neighborhoods less safe over time. Economic models miss black swan events like the 2008 financial crash because their underlying assumptions treat instability as an outlier, not a constant. When failure comes to the Ringworld, it's not just a technical problem, it's a political one. The system's inhabitants have no tools for adapting because they've never been allowed to manage their own environments. They've been optimized into dependence. This is where Niven's imagined future converges with the critiques of thinkers like James C. Scott, whose Seeing Like a State examines how top-down, high modernist schemes, from collectivized agriculture to urban redevelopment, fail precisely because they erase local knowledge in favor of centralized design. The Ringworld is a high modernist dream scaled up to cosmic proportions, and its collapse follows the same pattern. The system works until it doesn't, and then there's nothing outside it to fall back on. In fiction, this collapse can be solved with cleverness. Lewis Wu and company can find the fix, reboot the system, and restore balance. In reality, the consequences are slower, messier, and far more brutal. Communities displaced by megaprojects don't get written back into the story once the engineers move on. The managed future is always a fragile one because it mistakes control for resilience. And yet, in Ringworld, as in so much technocratic science fiction, the failure doesn't prompt a rethink of the system. It prompts a call to repair it, to make it work as intended. The lesson is not, maybe this level of control is impossible or undesirable. The lesson is, we just need to fix the glitches. This is the ideology of control at its most seductive. The belief that if you can just get the parameters right, you can design away politics, inequality, and conflict. The Ringworld becomes the ultimate metaphor for this belief, a perfect structure whose perfection hides its brittleness until it's too late. Labor as destiny, work, reproduction, and the engineered body. In Ringworld, labor is not something you do. It's something you are. Every significant character is defined by what they've been bred, trained, or built to perform. Nessus serves as the cautious strategist. Speaker to Animals is the fighter. Tila is the companion and test subject. Lewis Wu is the solver, the synthesizer, the man designed to navigate crises. Each body is optimized for a role, and every role is fixed. This is labor as destiny, and it's one of the oldest organizing principles in human history. Feudal Europe tied peasants to the land, their work and identity inseparable. The transatlantic slave trade commodified African bodies, not just for physical labor, but for the reproduction of that labor. A generational extraction that treated fertility itself as an asset to be owned. Industrial capitalism didn't abolish these logics, it simply retooled them, making workers interchangeable parts in a machine they don't control. Niven's world updates the logic for a high-tech future. The division of labor isn't enforced by chains or overseers, it's enforced by biology. You don't need to discipline a worker if you've designed them to enjoy their work or to be incapable of imagining a different life. This is where Ringworld's eugenics program converges with real-world histories of reproductive control. As Silvia Federici documents, the capitalist order that emerged in early modern Europe depended on the disciplining of women's reproductive labor, turning childbirth and domestic work into unpaid, invisible foundations for the waged economy. In colonial contexts, this took even more violent forms: forced sterilizations of indigenous women in the Americas and Australia, population control experiments in Puerto Rico, and coercive birth policies targeting Roma women in Eastern Europe. The ideological through line is the same. Reproduction is not a private act, but a managed resource. In Ringworld, this management is clean, clinical, and invisible. You never see the coercion. You just see its results. A population neatly aligned with the system's needs. Tila Brown doesn't need to be forced into her role. She was bred for it. The genius of this design, if you can call it that, is that there is no resistance, because there is no alternative to resist toward. Louis Wu is not an exception to this rule. His intelligence and survival skills are the product of the same lottery breeding system that produced Tila. The difference is that his traits position him as a leader, while hers position her as a supporting element. That asymmetry echoes the gendered division of labor in our own world, where traits coded as male, rationality, problem-solving, decisiveness, are rewarded with authority, while traits coded as female, emotional labor, aesthetic appeal, loyalty, are rewarded with mere proximity to it. In the real world, we can see how these hierarchies have been embedded into both law and technology. Algorithmic hiring tools replicate decades of bias, downgrading resumes with indicators of women's experience or non-white sounding names. Gig economy platforms optimize labor by matching workers to tasks based on profiles that measure reliability and compliance more than skill or creativity. If your biology, your social category, or your engineered traits limit your life chances, the system doesn't need to punish you directly. Your role is the punishment. In Ringworld, there's no organized labor, no collective bargaining, no politics of work at all. That absence isn't an oversight. It's a feature of the world's design. When labor is genetically predetermined, solidarity across roles becomes almost unthinkable. The fighter has nothing in common with the strategist with the companion. Shared struggle is replaced by functional complementarity. That's the most insidious part of engineered labor. It makes exploitation invisible. In our world, the gig driver and the software engineer both participate in the same economic system, but their vastly different conditions can be obscured by the idea that each is suited to their role. On the Ringworld, this logic is absolute, because the system claims the very bodies themselves are naturally suited. The concept of natural fit has always been political. In the US, 19th century racial science argued that African Americans were physically suited to manual labor, but not intellectual work. In colonial India, the British codified caste into labor categories, assigning entire communities to hereditary occupations and treating this as immutable tradition rather than the result of centuries of imposed hierarchy. Niven's universe inherits these ideas and wraps them in futuristic packaging. You don't see whips or wage theft, you see an elegant ecology of function, a puzzle where every piece fits perfectly. The cost of that fit is invisible. The suppression of any trait, ambition, or deviation that doesn't serve the system's blueprint. And the system has no contingency for those who fall outside its design. In our world, this takes the form of surplus populations, workers rendered unnecessary by automation, globalization, or policy. In Ringworld, it's simpler. The surplus are never born. This is where the novel's optimism about design curdles into fatalism. If your place in the world is not chosen but bred, then resistance becomes biologically improbable. You are what you were made to be. And when the system begins to fail, as it inevitably does, there's no mechanism for adaptation, because the bodies that could imagine alternatives don't exist. That's the real dystopia of Ringworld, not the crumbling megastructure. It's the quiet efficiency of a labor system that reproduces itself in flesh, one generation at a time. The future as management. What makes Ringworld compelling and unsettling is that it doesn't imagine a world without inequality. It imagines a world where inequality has been engineered into the foundations of life itself. There are no uprisings in this future, not because injustice has been solved, but because the system has designed away the possibility of dissent. This is the fantasy of perfect management. It's not the chaos of warlords or the brutality of a police state. It's the hum of a machine that has already decided the parameters of human life and left nothing outside its scope. The Ringworld is beautiful. It's vast. It's an achievement of almost unimaginable engineering. And it's a cage. Not a cage you can see, but a cage you can inherit. Every gene, every trait, every role, all set in place long before you were born. That's the seduction of technocracy at its most complete. The belief that we can design away politics, that we can solve conflict not by building coalitions or redistributing power, but by adjusting the human inputs until the outputs behave. In the real world, this logic appears in quieter forms. Predictive policing that allocates more patrols to high-crime areas, reinforcing the very patterns it claims to prevent. Educational tracking systems that label children as gifted or struggling and set them on divergent paths that rarely cross again. Urban optimization projects that turn neighborhoods into clean, surveilled investment zones after the inconvenient residents have been displaced. In each case, the system presents itself as neutral. It's just math. It's just design. It's just efficiency. But the parameters were always political. The algorithm didn't emerge from nowhere. The categories didn't create themselves. They were built on history, on the same racial, gendered, and class hierarchies that have always decided who counts. This is why Niven's Ringworld still matters as a political text, not because it predicts the future, but because it reflects an ideology that's alive and well, the dream of a world so perfectly ordered that human freedom becomes irrelevant. Critics might say, it's just a story. It's just science fiction. But stories are not harmless. They're rehearsals. They make certain futures feel natural, inevitable, even desirable. A Ringworld future doesn't have to be physically possible for its logic to shape how we build the systems around us. And if that logic becomes invisible, if we stop seeing it as a choice, then we will live inside its cage without ever knowing the bars are there. A future worth fighting for isn't one where everyone fits perfectly into their assigned slot. It's one where the slots themselves can be broken apart, rebuilt, or discarded entirely. It's one where abundance doesn't come at the cost of autonomy, and where difference is not an obstacle to be engineered away, but the very condition of collective survival. That's the challenge Ringworld leaves us with, maybe unintentionally. If we're building worlds, whether in fiction, in code, or in concrete, we have to ask, whose future does this world make possible? And whose does it quietly erase? Because design is never neutral, and a managed future is never truly free. That's it for episode 5 of Red Horizons. We've walked through the Ringworld, stared up at its endless horizon, and seen the hidden architecture holding it in place. An architecture of genes, roles, and managed futures. Next time, we're not leaving Niven's universe. We're following the logic of control beyond the ring and into the rest of his imagined futures. Because if Ringworld shows us how a system can engineer its people, the novels that follow show us that that same logic gets applied at the scale of planets, empires, and entire civilizations. We'll look at the ARM, the United Nations covert police force, and the technocratic state it serves. We'll explore how risk, probability, and preventative security become tools for empire, and how Niven's fiction channels a Cold War fascination with surveillance into a blueprint for governance. Until then, remember, the most dangerous systems are the ones that make themselves invisible. Red Horizons is written, produced, and hosted by Steve McPhail. Original music by Parker Kent. You can find us on every major podcast platform or at patreon.com/Red Horizons Pod. No ads, no algorithms, just revolutionary futures.